So, uh, we've been encouraged to share our stories, and those of you who know me know that I like to tell stories, so this is a story that I like to tell. Uh, where do you start? Uh, I started out as a child. I was raised by a single mother who worked hard to raise me and my brother, and my brother and I, we grew up as boys who had a lot of freedom, and we pretty much did what we wanted to do. Through our teenage years, we discovered the varieties of things that are open to young men, and in the 60s, that included rock and roll and drinking and drugs and everything else that goes with that. And my brother, I like to tell the story on Bill, that Bill went into the Marine Corps in 1969. He dropped out of high school, joined the Marine Corps. And Bill, in his late teens, was not a nice guy. He was, this is what I say, and those of you who know Bill, bear with me because I love my brother. But he was a mean, womanizing, drug abusing crud. He could be vicious, and sometimes would beat the tar out of me just for the heck of it. And but I love my brother. Uh, he came home in 1970 on leave from the Marine Corps, and something had changed in him, and it was apparent. His countenance had changed, and I asked him. I said, "Bill, what happened to you?" And he said, "Well, I met Jesus." Well, he might as well said I'd been to Mars. I mean, it's like, what do you mean you met Jesus? And Bill sat down and tried to explain to me about this Jesus that the Bible talks about, and how this Jesus is alive, and this Jesus has power to help those who come to him looking for help. And I tried to understand. I tried to believe like my brother believed, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. So I went on with my life. 1971, I dropped out of high school, joined the Army. The Army was good to me. They sent me to Vietnam. And one of the downsides of the Army is you have a lot of young men away from any restraining influence of their home and their neighborhood. And so I continued my spiral of blatant sin while serving in the Army. But in the Army, in Vietnam in particular, I began to get an interest in life after death. I began to consider the fact of mortality in a way that generally young people don't. And I began to kind of look for this God, this Jesus, who my brother had spoken about, and but I could not find him, and so I set it on the side. Uh, I have to confess, I came back from Vietnam something of a mess. Uh, you talk about guys coming back and having a hard time adjusting and not being able to hold a job and having multiple issues. Well, I was one of those multiple issues guys. But over the next few years, I would say God cleaned me up without my doing much about it. He took away my taste for drugs, began to make me look kind of civilized, and in 1978, 79, I met a pretty girl named Jane Jakubowski, and over the course of time, she agreed to marry me. And it was interesting that I was cleaned up enough to look civilized, because if Jane had met me in my wilder days, she probably wouldn't have. And I promised her the American dream. I was working my way in a retail business towards owning my own business, and I promised her all the things that America could promise: fine house, fine life, expensive stuff. And in about 1979. We got married in, well, take it back. I lose track of my years a little bit. We got married in that January of 1980. In 1980, my business that I had began to flounder after we got married, and the pressure of having a new wife that I'd promised everything to, and having my business floundering led me to sort of a despairing position. And in my despair, I began to drink again to anesthetize myself. And one day, while sipping on a beer, I looked up at the shelf, and on my bookshelf was a copy of Good News for Modern Man that a stranger had given me, and I had saved because I was too superstitious to throw it away. And I looked at that book, and I remembered my brother telling me that this Jesus that you can read about in this book has power to help. And so I began to read about this Jesus. And I read the New Testament just like you read any other book. And what I saw in the New Testament was that it was very clear that the God spoken of in this book has power. There was no doubt in my mind. I was already established in the reality of life after death and something beyond that from my experience in Vietnam. And it seemed from reading the New Testament that this power to help was available to anyone who'd come to him and ask. So I decided I was going to ask God for help with my business. And so I tried to go ask him. And an interesting thing happened to me. And I'll tell you the way I remember it because it's just interesting to me. Every time I try to ask God for help, this is the picture that remains in my mind. It was like God is alive and his throne room is filled with perfect light. And I'd be approaching the doorway to the throne room, and I'd be in the hallway just around the corner in the shadow, and I could see the light streaming out the door. And every time I went to go ask him for help, as I'd get up to the edge of the door, the light revealed my uncleanness to me. And it was like, oh my gosh, I'm dirty. And I would back up and try to clean up. And I tried such things as cleaning up my vocabulary because I had sort of a salty vocabulary in those days. That didn't work. I felt like maybe I should quit smoking because that seemed wrong. I'd try to approach and go into the light, and I'd see all this pollution I was pouring into myself, and so I'd back up and I'd try to quit smoking, but I smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day. I couldn't quit. I tried to approach into the light to ask God for help, and I got convicted about cheating on my taxes. And I was like, I got to cheat on my taxes. I need the money. It was terrible, terrible dilemma. In the midst of that dilemma, knowing full that God was alive, believing the testimony that he would help those who came to him in prayer and asked for help, and yet being held at a distance because of my uncleanness and being powerless to clean myself up, was a terrible position. And in the midst of that position, a friend, a fellow I'd known for a few years, invited me to come to church. And he said, Tom, he said, I know how you feel about churches. I know how you feel about religion, because we've talked about this stuff. But come listen to this man talk. This is different. And because he'd been my friend, I believed him that it would be different. And I saw something in his life that was different. So Jane and I went to church. And I remember that day, one, I was impressed that people seemed to be glad to be in church. I didn't know that people would be glad to be in church, but they all seemed glad to be there. And when the pastor got up to preach, I don't remember exactly the message, but I remember he was teaching something topically, and he'd say, well, now over here, Paul says this, and like a little bell would go off my head and say, yeah, that's what I read. That's what it says. And he said, and here, in this place here, we read this. And I went, yeah, that's what I read. And over here, we read this. And I went, yeah, that's what he said. And then it suddenly, like the bell really went off my head. It was like, oh, This guy's not giving me his opinion about stuff. He's telling me what the book says. So now he had my attention. At any rate, he got towards the end, and this was kind of a charismatic church. And he said, you know, everybody praying, heads bowed, no one looking around. He said, if you're here today, and you would say by raising your hand, Pastor, I need Jesus, I want you to raise your hand. And Jane started pushing on my arm. Raise your hand, raise your hand. And I was like, no, I don't need Jesus. I need help with the business. And while that little exchange was going on, he said, if you're here today, and by raising your hand, you'd be saying, I know that I'm not right with God. I want you to raise your hand. I want to pray for you. And it was like, oh yeah, that's me. I absolutely knew I was not right with God. There was no doubt. That was the thing keeping me from him. At any rate, while this was going on, then I raised my hand. Some guy came over and said, hi, what's your name? I said, Tom. He said, oh, that's my name too. I thought, yeah, sure it is. And he said, listen, he said, I'd like to pray for you, Tom. Would you come with me up to the altar? I said, okay. And we started walking up there, and I started looking around. It's a big church, about 500 people, and the music's playing, and they're all praying, and people are praying out loud, and I started to get weirded out. You know, it's like, this is some kind of cult, man. They're going to make me drink the Kool-Aid. But Tom turned to me, and he said, no need to be embarrassed. And I went, okay. So we went up there to pray, and he had me kneel down, and Tom knelt down with me. He put his hand on my shoulder. Another guy named Leon put his hand on my shoulder. And I will never forget what Tom prayed. He said, Father, I don't know what sin is in this young man's life, but I ask you for Jesus' sake to forgive him. And I'm telling you that at that moment, it was like a ton of bricks went off my shoulders. Like a ton of bricks lifted off of me. It was stunning. The altar call thing was still going on. Tom was still praying, but I think my eyes were popped open. Something had happened. I was not carrying the burden anymore. And I thought, well, I wonder if I can get up from this place. And I went to try to think about getting up, but it felt like somebody was standing on my forearms on that altar, and I couldn't move. And I thought, well, must be we're not done. And it went on for a little bit, and then Tom said to me, he said, Tom, I'd like to explain something to you. And he pulled out a thing about 4 spiritual laws. And he explained about how man was created in perfect communion with God, and how sin separated man from God, and how all of our efforts fall short. And the only thing that bridges the gap is the sacrifice that God appointed, Jesus, his son. He said, would you like to accept Jesus? And I went, at this point, they could have led me anywhere. I said, sure. So he said, well, pray this prayer with me. And I prayed the prayer with him. But on the back end of the prayer, silently, I walked into the throne room where God lives in unapproachable light, where I could never get through the door before. And I asked him for help with my business. And being a brand new, squalling infant Christian, didn't know how to pray, just said, God, if you want me in this business, my business is failing. If I don't have sales this week, I'm going to have to close the doors. If you want me in this business, give me some sales this week. If you don't want me in this business, don't let me sell anything this week, and I will close the doors next Saturday. And God, in his mercy, gave me absolutely 0 sales that week and put me out of business. But everything was good because now my life was in his hands, and I knew that he was in charge and taking care of everything. And he is and has been growing me up ever since. That was almost 40 years ago now. And I just want to say, God is faithful. He is alive. This Jesus has power to help those who come to him. He does not cast out anyone who comes to him. He's merciful. He will bring you to that place where you can enter into that Holy of Holies because your sins are forgiven. For Jesus' sake. Not for yours. For Jesus' sake. God bless you, brothers. Have a great day.